On any day, all around our country, people from churches are teaching students in schools, running hospitals, caring for people in difficult circumstances and making our country a better place.
We should teach our history the way it was. That, in large part, is our Judeo-Christian history. It helps constitute who we are as a people, as the basis of our parliamentary democracy, the Westminster tradition.
From the Australian Christian Lobby, The Political Spot.
Welcome to The Political Spot. I'm Daniel Simon. The Australian Christian Lobby has just held its annual national conference in Canberra with the theme of Speak Up. One of the speakers speaking up was Roger Kiska from the Alliance Defending Freedom in Europe. I caught up with Roger after the conference. I'm with Roger Kiska, who was one of our speakers here today at ACL's national conference. Roger is a lawyer with the Alliance Defending Freedom in Europe. Roger, thank you for your address today. Can I start by asking you a little bit about yourself? You told me you are the son of Slovakian refugees in Canada. Tell us a bit about your personal journey and how you ended up professionally with Alliance Defending Freedom in Europe.
Well, sure. Yes, in 1968, the Russians came into the former Czechoslovakia, what is now Slovakia, into the capital city, Bratislava. And as a result of that, my parents fled and chose to go to Canada. I grew up in a culturally Catholic family who nonetheless were very strong ideologically against communism. So I knew the ideological threats of radical secular belief and grew up knowing the dangers of a world that didn't have faith. And that stayed with me for a long time, even though I didn't become a Christian until I was 19 years old. I had decided at 19 to go down to the United States and had a master's degree in theology out there. Went to law school following that and wanted to find a way to unite my faith in my vocation. Ended up heading out back to Europe, practicing religious liberty with the American Center for Law and Justice. Followed that by working with Alliance Defending Freedom. So for 12 years, I have been working in the area of litigation for religious liberty.
Right, now in your speech, you distinguish between freedom of worship and freedom of religion. Can you explain this distinction?
You know, this idea of freedom of worship is being propagated by a number of leaders, particularly on the left. Heard it coming out of the United Nations. President Obama in the United States is very keen on using it. And today, the Honourable Opposition Leader used it in his remarks. And freedom of worship is such a limiting term. It is basically telling Christians that you are free to, within your congregation, act as Christians or in the privacy of your own home. But if you go out into the public square, you best keep your faith to yourself. And freedom of religion is the real right that we have, which includes, obviously, the freedom to worship. But it also means that in the public square we can bring our faith, whether it be in the university, in the halls of the legislature, in employment, or as a provider of goods and services. We have a right to conscientiously object and to follow our moral beliefs. It's a right that's protected under the law, internationally and domestically.
Yeah. Now, you mentioned that the Honourable Opposition Leader, Mr. Bill Shorten, mentioned that phrase, freedom of worship. Another phrase that he used, which you picked up on in your speech, was marriage equality. And you used the term so-called equality in this context of marriage equality. Why do you say so-called? What is it about the word equality that you are taking issue with here?
Well, you know, the term equality is such a politically correct term. Everyone wants to be equal. But discrimination by its nature requires there to be a distinction between two things that are similar. Now, marriage, by definition, requires biological complementarity. Reproductive systems work only when there is a man and a woman, and marriage has always been centered around family. And so to suggest that two elements, you know, the partners involved who don't have complementary, they cannot, by definition, create a marriage. And so it's not a question of equality, it's a question of redefinition. And that's what this debate is really about, redefining marriage.
One of the things that you said in your speech, you identified anti-discrimination legislation as a considerable threat to religious freedom. And you said non-discrimination legislation discriminates equally. Can you explain that a bit for us?
The history of the non-discrimination litigation in Europe, and it has been very litigious, has affected Catholics, Orthodox, Evangelicals, Protestants, all Christian denominations alike. And in that sense, I meant that anti-discrimination discriminates equally. Every time there has been a clash in the UK and other jurisdictions in Europe between religious freedom, which is a fundamental human right recognized by just about every major international treaty, with sexual orientation, religious freedom is lost. And that shouldn't be the law. And it really is decimating religious freedom and the ability of people of faith to live out that faith publicly.
Yeah, and you mentioned case after case in your address today where Christians are being victims of this kind of legislation. Can you name a few of those and explain why it's this non-discrimination agenda that's causing these victims?
I mean, there are so many cases going on that are well known. One that I mentioned today was the case of Peter and Hazel Mary Bull, who were bed and breakfast owners, a lovely elderly Christian couple who simply wanted to run a ministry out of their home through a bed and breakfast. One of their policies was that because of their Christian faith, they would not let a double bed to a non-married couple. So that is not a discriminatory policy. The farthest thing from it, because it applied equally to heterosexual couples as to same-sex couples who weren't married, because of their belief in the sanctity of marriage. And in 2009, a same-sex couple challenged them on it, brought a civil lawsuit for discrimination. The result was that the legal fees associated with defending themselves bankrupted the bed and breakfast. It's a question of people in the privacy of their own home not being able to live out their faith. In Hereford, in the United Kingdom, the Anglican diocese there faced a lawsuit because they refused to hire a youth pastor openly engaged in the homosexual lifestyle. If a Christian church can't protect its own moral ethos, who can? So, I mean, these cases, as I mentioned, have grown exponentially in the past 3-4 years.
Hate speech is another term that we hear a lot. Increasingly, we hear it about Christian comments, pastors, Christian leaders who talk about particularly issues of sexuality and marriage. But as you mentioned in your speech, even the UN is confused about what hate speech is. What's the problem with the concept of hate speech?
Well, first of all, hate speech reduces freedom of speech, and we need freedom of speech. Freedom of speech transforms cultures. By way of example, if it wasn't for Lech Walesa and Pope John Paul II and the trade unions in Poland, there would still be a USSR today. It was freedom of expression mixed with freedom of association that transformed that culture, that led to the fall of the Berlin Wall. Hate speech is a nebulous term. It's been left undefined, and the reason for that is so that the powers that could be, whether they be activists, judges, or legislators, can define what is and what isn't permissible speech. And what that leads to is what we call viewpoint discrimination, where certain views are tolerated because they meet the cultural orthodoxy of the day, and any other view is deemed to be bigoted, small-minded, or hateful, and it can be subject to criminal sanction. It's not uncommon in Europe for street preachers, for example, to be arrested for preaching on moral issues. As I mentioned in my talk today, 4 Catholic bishops in Europe have had 5 hate speech cases brought against them for preaching on these moral issues. What that does is it causes a major chilling effect on Christians. They think twice about speaking on these matters, and that is, precisely the death knell of freedom of expression in Europe. And it's
now, ADF is largely a group of lawyers, and you're a lawyer yourself. What are the legal approaches and the legal arguments that you are making and that you're having to draw on in these cases that we're seeing?
Well, the natural law, the laws that are endowed by God, are all well represented in the international treaties. My personal practice is in the European Convention of Human Rights. That document heavily drew upon the International Covenant on Civil Political Rights, and before that, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Those are all fundamental human rights that are already existent in nature. And what the drafters of those documents recognized, those came out of the 1950s after World War I and World War II, was that states had seized the reins of power, and that it wasn't the role of the state. These documents weren't supposed to nudge states into a better direction. It was supposed to endow individuals with these rights. And what we're seeing now, just a few generations after the fact, that governments are again trying to indoctrinate regular citizens with these ideas. And so we go in and when we use legal arguments that have existed for centuries, which are part of the natural law, and we've been successful in them. They're well defined, they make sense from a policy perspective, and they're far better than the alternative.
Yeah. Now, despite some concerns in Australia from some people, I think it's easy for a lot of people to feel comfortable here. ADF was founded in the US, I believe, which was founded on the idea of freedom of speech, religious freedom. And of course they have their First Amendment, and still we're seeing this kind of thing happen in the US and this freedom disappear. Now in your region of Europe, hundreds and hundreds of years of Christian culture and Christian history, now so hostile. Why are we here? What do you think's happened in the last generation or so to get to this point?
I mean, the culture has certainly changed. It's become one which, seeks to have complete individual freedom without taking any responsibility for their action. We see that with abortion on demand. We see that with people wanting to undermine, marriage, which has been around since the beginning of time, an institution ordained by God, for their own purposes. One of the reasons we've got this far is not only because they've been pushing the agenda, but because Christians haven't been engaging in the agenda. You look at the United Nations, for example, which has those wonderful founding documents, but the culture within the United Nations is so antithetical to these views now, to life, to family, precisely because Christians and conservatives alike haven't engaged it. They've either been absolutely non-engaging or they've dealt with these institutions with incredulity. And the fact is that the other side, the opposition, is now very comfortable in those halls, and they are very hostile to the Christian worldview precisely because we haven't been in those halls with them. And when Alliance Defending Freedom opened its doors in 1994, the realization was we have been losing these battles not because we don't have the legal arguments on our side, but because we haven't been participating. We've been sitting on the sidelines. And so our hope is that Christian lawyers in Australia, Christian activists and lobbyists in Australia will get involved.
And what about the numbers? Do you think that there is a latent, silent Christian majority in America, in Europe, in Australia?
Absolutely. The cultures, Europe is known as Christendom. It's still a majority Christian. The United States is incredibly Christian. And Australia, I've only been here for a few days, but it's palpable. And the legal culture, the morality, the Judeo-Christian history is just so palpable. And, Christians have become complacent. And they've allowed themselves to be governed by political correctness. No one wants to offend. Everyone wants to be considered tolerant. And that's been a very radical tool that's being used to silence Christians. And Christians need to realize that tolerance does not mean love. That love sometimes means taking action. It's my hope that Christians will get out of their pews more and get involved in this culture war.
The Political Spot from the Australian Christian Lobby at www.acl.org.au.